Hello, I'm Anna King, President of the National PTA, our nation's oldest and largest child advocacy association. I'm having this conversation today from the great state of Oklahoma. I have on a burnt orange sweater, dark brown hair. I am an African American woman with glasses on and beautiful gold hoop earrings. I'm very pleased to be here today with Dr. Lois Lee, Chair of the American Academy of Pediatrics Council on Injury, Violence, and Poison Intervention, and Dr. Tom Simon, Associate Director for Science at the National Center for Injury Prevention and Control at the CDC, for an important conversation on community violence intervention and gun violence prevention. PTA members from across the country have always played a critical role in advocating for common sense solutions to gun violence. And we were pleased to see Congress come together and pass the Bipartisan Safer Community Act this summer. For so many years, we have called for action and sensible gun safety and violence prevention policies that will make our schools and communities safer and save lives. This law will be a significant step forward in addressing the school safety and gun violence epidemic our country has endured for far too long, and particularly in the wake of a horrific shooting at Robb Elementary School in Uvalde, Texas earlier this year. But more needs to be done to heal our communities and prevent future tragedies from occurring. And we must ensure the successful and equitable implementation of the Bipartisan Safer Community Act on the ground. Yes, we've made progress this year together, but gun violence continues to destroy our communities. In fact, just a few weeks ago, there was a shooting in my home state of Oklahoma, only 15 minutes away from my daughter's home, where Teron Yarbrough, a 17-year-old, was shot and killed at a homecoming game. Teron was like other kids his age. He went to school every day. He loved sports and attended church. He was survived by 7 siblings, his mother, his grandmothers, and many loving relatives and friends. From the suburbs to the cities to the country, this affects all of us. That is why we must together address the social, economic, and behavioral causes that lead to the multifaceted problem and the cycle of violence, especially in incidents that involve firearms. National PTA remains deeply committed to addressing the alarming spike in community violence and youth suicide by firearm currently facing our nation's families. Suicide is currently the 3rd leading cause of death for young people and the 2nd leading cause of death for youth ages 10 to 14. Think about this. Almost 1 in 5 high school students report that they have had serious thoughts of suicide. Just last year, the U.S. Surgeon General and leading children's health organizations declared a national emergency in children and adolescent mental health, sounding the alarm on the mental health crisis facing our young people today. Scary, isn't it? We must recommit ourselves to eliminating the negative impacts of violence and suicide felt by whole school communities and prevent it from occurring to ensure that every child can reach their fullest potential. If we can't protect our children and keep them safe at school, how can we help them reach their fullest potential? And who will carry our nation into the brighter future? I feel energized to be joined here today by our distinguished panelists who will help us understand this issue and how PTA leaders from across the country can build a strong history of coming together to make sure that our children are safe inside of our schools. It is without a doubt my honor to welcome our panelists, Dr. Lee and Dr. Simon. Now for the questions. What brought you both to this work? And Dr. Lois Lee, we'll start with you.
Hello, everybody. Yes, I'm Dr. Lois Lee. I am chair of the Council on Injury at American Academy of Pediatrics, but my day job is as a pediatric emergency medicine physician at Boston Children's Hospital. I am a petite Asian woman. I have dark black hair and brown eyes, and I'm very pleased to be here today. So what has brought me to this work is, as a practicing physician, I see children get injured from lots of different things every day. And the vast majority of these injuries are preventable. So we have a healthy child who gets injured, and sometimes the injuries are minor and they recover, but sometimes the injuries are lifelong, cause lifelong disability. And other times the injuries are actually fatal. So since I was a resident, I have been doing research and advocacy related to injury prevention for children. And firearms, particularly, I think, are an area that requires a really coordinated effort, both from researchers, physicians, but also public health and child advocates like the NPTA. But most importantly, perhaps I also speak as a parent and really looking out for improving the lives of all our children in every way that we can. And so that's really what brought me to this work for firearm injury prevention, to see what are the solutions that we can work on together as citizens in the US to really make sure we're keeping our kids safe.
Thank you, Dr. Lee. How about you, Dr. Simon?
So thank you so much, Anna, for inviting me here today to discuss this really important issue. I'm just grateful to you and the National PTA for your leadership in this area. The topic of firearm homicide and suicide is just so personal to many of us, and I'll share it's true for me as well. I've been impacted by the death of someone close to me from firearm suicide. And I've seen how a day can just start off normal, like any other day, and then just in an instant turn into tragedy with lifelong consequences. I also share that I have a daughter who's just grown up with active shooter drills in her school as just a normal part of the school process. And I remember it wasn't that long ago, she experienced a lockdown in her school because somebody had robbed a store next to the high school and actually brought the gun, was carrying the firearm onto the school campus. So the school was in lockdown. As a parent, that text, that notification that her school was in lockdown, and the feeling that I had of helplessness and concern for her and her teachers and her classmates, I'll never forget that feeling. And I also share that my wife works as a teacher at our local elementary school with special needs kids. So this issue is near and dear to me. And my personal career started when I was in college and working evenings on a 24-hour crisis hotline. And substance use and violence and suicide were just central themes to the calls that I took. And I did my best, but I believe that more was needed to be done in terms of preventing these issues from happening in the first place. And so that's why I went to graduate school at the University of Southern California, the Institute for Prevention Research. I was planning to study substance use prevention, and this was actually during the crack cocaine epidemic that we were experiencing in the mid-1990s. And one of the first projects that I was involved with had me going into alternative high schools, and my job was to interview students and staff about their experiences with drugs. But what I found was that everybody that I talked to wanted to talk to me about violence, not drugs. Many of the students shared with me that they didn't really care about the consequences of drug use at that time because they didn't believe that they would live past the age of 25. Many of them had lost friends and family to violence. And at the same time, the school staff were also disclosing that they actually felt afraid of the students. I decided to do my dissertation on youth gun carrying to try to better understand the reasons for gun carrying. I learned how often youth carry guns or other weapons because they feel vulnerable. They don't believe that law enforcement can or would protect them. And while I was working on my dissertation, much of the research that I was reading at the time was coming out of CDC. This is all describing how violence is not just a law enforcement problem, but also a public health problem. And so I decided to apply for a fellowship at CDC's Division of Violence Prevention. And I actually got the privilege of working with the folks whose work that I was reading while I was in graduate school. And so I've been with the Division of Violence Prevention at CDC ever since.
Wow. Thank you, Dr. Simon. Losing a sibling to suicide by gun, I completely understand how hard it can take on a family, and you don't really recuperate from that. You just become stronger and becoming more aware. So thank you for sharing your personal story, both of you. Thank you so much. This question is for you, Dr. Simon. We've heard people use the phrase adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, which is somewhat of a technical term, but gets to the heart of what we are trying to prevent for our children. I know the CDC has researched ACEs, including a recent report which found that nearly 3 out of 4 students experience at least one recent ACE, such as emotional abuse or food insecurity. Would you share a bit more about this research? Also, from the CDC's perspective, can you give us some content on violence more broadly and how has COVID-19 impacted the data that you're seeing?
Sure, I'm happy to do that. So ACEs, or adverse childhood experiences, are preventable, potentially traumatic events that occur in childhood. It can result in toxic stress and actually have lifelong consequences on health. As you mentioned, it can include a range of things: witnessing violence in the home, also aspects of a child's environment that can undermine their sense of safety and stability. And as you mentioned, we just released a report last week on ACEs, and we found that 73% of the high school students surveyed reported they'd experienced at least one ACE during the COVID-19 pandemic. And the study also looked at the association between these experiences of ACEs and health consequences. And they found that students who reported even just one or two recent ACEs were twice as likely to report mental health problems and 3 to 6 times more likely to report suicidal behaviors. And among the ACEs that we studied, emotional abuse actually had the strongest link to poor mental health and suicidal behavior. And you also asked about the broader issue of violence under COVID, and I'll share that this report was just one of several that we released over the past year describing this issue of violence under COVID. Back in May, we released a vital signs report showing that the firearm homicide rate increased nearly 35% between 2019 and 2020, coinciding with the COVID pandemic. This increase of a 35% change in the rate in 1 year is really unprecedented. And then just 2 weeks ago, we released a new report to expand on that, and we used the provisional vital statistics data from 2021 to look at changes in both firearm homicide rates and suicide rates between 2020 and 2021. And unfortunately, we saw that the firearm homicide rate continued to increase. And we also saw increases in the suicide rate. Both of them actually went up 8% just in between 2020 and 2021. So this means with these increases, the firearm homicide rate is the highest that we've seen in our country since 1993. It actually takes us back to where we were during the peak of the crack cocaine epidemic in our country. And the suicide rate is the highest we've seen since 1990, the firearm suicide rate. So I'll just also add that these increases were pretty pervasive across groups, but they weren't equal. In our study, we found significant racial and ethnic disparities in firearm homicide rates and some firearm suicide rates. And many of these disparities actually have widened over time. So just to put that in perspective, among those ages 10 to 24, the firearm homicide rate for Black youth was about 20 times as high as the rate among white people. And in 2021, it was almost 25 times as high. So we're going in the wrong direction. And we know longstanding systemic inequities in housing, education, employment, structural racism, they all contribute to unfair and avoidable disparities like these that we're seeing. And a lot of people ask about, well, what are the reasons for the increases? And there's lots of explanations have been proposed. And unfortunately, the data don't allow us to answer that question, with precision. But among the explanations that have been proposed, there's reason to believe that the stressors associated with the COVID-19 pandemic, including, mental stress, social isolation, changes that we saw in disruptions to services and our school system, as well as economic stressors like job loss, housing instability, difficulty covering daily expenses. All of these factors could have contributed to the increases that we've seen. And we know that the effects of the pandemic were worse in certain minority and racial communities. So that's possibly part of the reason for the increase and potentially contributing to the widening inequities that we've seen. But I'll just end by saying that the high levels of the adverse childhood experiences and the increasing and record high firearm homicide and suicide rates just really underscore the urgency of comprehensive prevention efforts. So I'm glad to have this opportunity to talk today.
Wow. That information, just listening to that right now, is just pretty scary. It's the data numbers. You can't go wrong with data. And so, thank you so much for sharing that. And I'm really glad that we are having this conversation. Dr. Lee, from a medical perspective, what is the impact, particularly long term, on the individual children, parents, and educators when a school shooting or act of violence in the community occurs? And how do pediatricians work with families to address childhood ACEs? And what can we do as community leaders to determine a path towards healing from such an event and support our students and families' well being?
Thank you for that very important question. Unfortunately, over the last 2 decades, with the increasing number of school shootings, we actually do know that there are significant long-term effects, right, for not just the children, but their parents and their broader community. But children are particularly vulnerable because they're still developing their ability to understand and process these events. And particularly young children don't even have the vocabulary to talk about what they've seen, what they've heard, or how they're feeling. And then over time, there's this concept of the cumulative adversity and the ACEs, as well as the continued exposure to violence that can really have long-term, not only mental health effects, right, but also emotional and even physical, health effects. So, there are some things that pediatricians can do. Obviously, they need to continue to screen and assess for ACEs and connect children and their families to appropriate social and mental health services. And depending on where you are, unfortunately, there's huge inequities in availability and accessibility, right, to those types of services. As a parent, but also as a pediatrician, it is important, though, to assure children of safety and security so that they don't feel like they need to be in fear all the time, going to school, going to the mall, being at church. But they should also monitor their child's behavior, especially if they've been in an acute situation of violence or, unfortunately, a shooting. So are they, quieter than usual? Are they acting out more than usual? And I think it's important to really talk to the children and validate their feelings, right? Rather than just telling children to just, tough it out and bottle it up, which I think in years past was one way parents would tell children to cope. But we know that that's not good, right? And long term has significant mental and other effects. So really talking to them and validating their feelings, and maybe, for the older toddlers or even young school age, giving them the language, right, they need to talk about that they're mad, they're sad, they're afraid. But, we also have to recognize that these violent acts, as Dr. Simon mentioned, really do not affect communities in the same way. So addressing specific types of violence like homicide and suicide, in the appropriate communities is very important. And then as leaders in the community, there actually are some really wonderful resources that we can tell parents and children about. So the Gabby Giffords Foundation has a toolkit on their website, and they have two different areas of focus, actually, which I think are important. One is just the immediate aftermath of the coping and healing. And they recommend just acknowledging and remembering about the violence, encouraging getting help, and then finding a community for support. And then when you're ready, advocating for change, both with peer-to-peer support, but also policy change. Similarly, Every Town for Gun Safety has also wonderful resources for families. So there is a community of people throughout the country who unfortunately have witnessed, survived similar experiences. But I think, again, reaching out to these communities can be very helpful on that road to healing, not just for children, but their families and their broader community.
Wow, thank you for sharing that, Lois. Man, this is a great conversation. I'm getting really excited about this. Okay, so now I'm going to come to you, Tom. We're eager and stand ready for solutions that schools can take. Are there any examples that you can share?
So I'm so glad you asked. Your members, as leaders in schools and communities, are really in a great position to raise awareness about opportunities for violence prevention. And to help leaders like you, the CDC has released a series of technical packages that summarize the best available evidence for violence prevention. And what I can do is just mention a few specific examples briefly, but there's a lot more that are available in the resource. And so when I think about examples, we can start very early. It's amazing the important and lasting benefits that early education programs like child parent centers and early Head Start can have. These programs create opportunities to support parents and engage them in their child's academic development. And they've actually been shown to be quite effective long term. There's been research that's followed the young people who participated in child parent centers until they were 24 years old, and they found a 22% reduction in arrests for violent crime rates among kids who've been exposed to child parent centers versus kids who were not exposed. And other studies have shown a range of positive benefits, like improved graduation rates, and improved attendance at four-year colleges as well. And then, of course, the prevention efforts need to continue. And there's examples of middle school and high school-based programs like life skills training, signs of suicide that can be implemented in classrooms, and they go a long way toward enhancing communication skills and problem-solving skills, increasing empathy, increasing impulse control, and they've been shown to have substantial benefits throughout development. There was one recent review of the literature on these types of school-based programs, and they concluded that they have, on average, a 15% relative reduction in aggressive behaviors across the programs, and that these effects really hold regardless of whether you're talking about males or females, regardless of the predominant race, ethnicity of the students, or the socioeconomic status of the students. So they're quite robust. And then I'll also mention that schools can be a safe location for students even beyond the school day. After school programs can address key risk and protective factors for youth violence by helping to provide supervision during critical times of the day when young people are at risk for violence. These programs often provide tutoring and homework assistance. There's one specific example that we describe in the technical packages. It's called After School Matters, and it offers high school students apprenticeship experiences in technology and science and communication and arts and sports. And there have been rigorous evaluations of that program that have found significant improvements, not just in graduation rates, but also reductions in drug selling and gang participation as well. And then we also need to make sure that students are arriving to school safely and getting home safely. And there's a really interesting program in Chicago that you might be aware of. It's called Chicago Safe Passage. And it provides students safe routes to and from school by placing community members along the routes. And these people are trained on conflict de-escalation strategies, and they have reporting protocols for violent behavior. And they've done some really interesting evaluation work on safe passages. And studies have shown benefits not just on school attendance, but also reductions in overall crime in the neighborhoods, and lower rates of violent crime as well. So these are just a few examples of prevention strategies that are specific to schools. I do think it's important to emphasize that we can't expect schools to do this alone, that there's a lot of violence that happens in schools that's really starting in the community. And so schools really need to be part of a larger comprehensive approach.
Wow. Great examples. And you just put the meaning behind it takes a village. So thank you for sharing.
You're
Lois,
welcome.
so here we go. We have 3 questions, and it's wrapped up into one. The first one, how can PTAs and families best partner with pediatricians and other experts to help prevent violence and keep our homes, communities, and schools safe? That's part 1. Additionally, how can our members support family discussions around school violence? And how can families and communities address trauma and heal after violence has occurred?
Some very important topics there. So, first of all, PTAs and families, should reach out to medical providers in their community, pediatricians, but of course, mental health providers as well, and hospitals, right? Hospital systems are also very engaged in keeping their communities safer. And I think engaging in community-based violence prevention programs is important. Oftentimes, teachers have the pulse of what's going on with their students at school, right? They can tell if something is not right, if a student is not coming to class or is coming to class not prepared, and just basically have the pulse on what's going on in the community of students. And so kind of identifying those kids, getting them into services that they might need, whether it is actually violence prevention services or more mental health focused, I think is really a critical role for schools and PTAs. But also, right, going back to the medical home, making sure that these are things not just happening in isolation for the student or for the community, but also feeding back to the pediatricians and the medical community that, as you said, it takes a village to help kids who are either victims and or witnesses or even perpetrators, right, of violence, that they all can get the help that they need. As far as how community members can, how the PTA members can support family discussions, I think it's actually having those discussions, right? We can't bury our head in the sand and pretend like these things aren't happening. And obviously the risks for violence, especially firearm violence, do vary around the country. And even though there's a lot of media around school shootings, overall, those are still very rare. So we do need to pay kind of more attention, right, to the more day-to-day firearm homicides as well as the risk for firearm suicides. And I think acknowledging that the risks are different, and as I mentioned before, really tailoring the needs to the specific communities. And I think having those discussions, right, have a speaker come in and talk to parents and as well as students about what's going on with violence of all types in our communities these days. And then figuring out, well, what are some of the solutions, right, that might work for your individual community. And then finally, how can families and communities address trauma and heal after violence? Again, engaging in these community violence intervention programs, either their intervention or sometimes their prevention programs, working together with hospitals that have these programs as well. And then using more community-based advocacy groups. So Moms Demand Action is actually a really wonderful organization, and there are many chapters in each state. So really more focused on your individual community and what your state needs. Lots of opportunities for advocacy. One of the things that I have learned about them is that they actually have this very active survivor network. And many of these people are mothers and parents and fathers, and really kind of speaking personally about how violence and firearm violence specifically has affected their lives and turning it around and really advocating for change so that other families don't have to experience the same thing. So I think, you can start with your pediatrician and then work through your larger sort of school, PTA, community, hospital systems, but then even broader to groups like Moms Demand Action and Every Town for Gun Safety.
Thank you, Lois. That's some great information. I love the fact that you said something about hospitals. We sometimes tend to forget that, right? Everyone goes to the hospital for some reason or not. Well, we don't want anybody to go to the hospital, but we do know that that happens. And thank you for sharing the information about Moms Demand Action. Very engaged in the local chapter, and you're right. They're boots on the ground, just like our PTA leaders, right? We know that building these partnerships with community organizations is key. And to have these conversations with our families. That's some great information. Thank you for sharing that. Tom, I am coming to you with another question. CDC champions community violence intervention. What does that mean, and what does that really look like on the ground? That's the first question. And the second question, what are some immediate measures our members and community leaders can help put in place? And what are longer term solutions to strive for?
Great question. And this builds on what Lois was just describing too. And, so community violence, it generally happens outside the home between unrelated individuals who may or may not know each other. It includes examples of violence that we see around us every day and in the news every day, assaults, fights, shootings in public places, including schools. And we know that young people are disproportionately impacted by community violence. There's multiple strategies that communities can take to reduce violence now and in the future. And I'll talk about a couple of examples. First, we must make sure that we're addressing the needs of people who are at greatest risk for experiencing violence. One really promising example that we're seeing in multiple communities around the country is street outreach programs. They've shown promising results for multiple outcomes, including firearm violence. They focus on really changing the norms about violence, connecting populations at highest risk for violence with community services, and by helping to reduce conflict in the community. Conflicts that might be escalating, they can go in and work with the people involved to reduce those tensions. When people are injured from violence, as Lois mentioned, hospital-based prevention strategies can be really helpful as well, and connecting them to services. This can be a real window of opportunity when someone has experienced a violence-related injury to a moment to reflect, a moment to work with them on other alternatives, connect them with educational services, employment services, connect their family to services as well. And then, another strategy regarding folks that are at greatest risk is, healthcare providers can promote safe storage of firearms by providing counseling and education and offering a safety device as well. We've seen research show that this process of counseling and providing a safety device can be associated with changes in behaviors and increased safer firearm storage practices. So in addition to working with the people who are at greatest risk, we also need to focus on the physical conditions within communities. We've seen multiple cities, Philadelphia, Flint, Michigan, have great success with programs that focus on cleaning and greening of vacant lots. These can increase the opportunities for positive social interactions and reduce the opportunities for violence that can occur in these places. Revitalized vacant lots have been shown to be associated with reduced firearm assaults, including having significant and particularly large reductions in areas within the cities that are experiencing the highest poverty. And then finally, in terms of what we can do now that will have lasting effects, it's really important to think about the underlying conditions that contribute to risk for violence and risk for inequities in violence. And we can help strengthen economic and household stability through approaches like housing assistance, childcare subsidies, we start that one over. We can help strengthen economic and household stability through approaches like housing assistance and childcare subsidies, tax credits, and livable wages. These are approaches that can really help to lift families out of poverty, reduce the stress that they're experiencing, and enhance positive outcomes. One specific example is earned income tax credits. These help individuals and families with lower incomes increase their income while incentivizing work. And an analysis of state-specific earned income tax credits showed that states with high tax credits were associated with a 10% lower rate of violent crime. So there's some real promise with these types of policy-based approaches. And I'll just mention these are just a few examples of community approaches that are included in the technical packages that I mentioned earlier. There's many others.
Thank you for sharing that information. I'm learning so much from you guys just sitting here in the conversation, and I really appreciate you guys sharing this. Lois, how does mental health play a role here? Do most people who commit violence face mental health challenges? Very interesting question. Very good question to. I can't wait for you to hear your answer. And will addressing a mental health crisis also solve the gun violence epidemic and keep our kids safe?
So thank you. As you mentioned, we really are in a mental health crisis. I have never seen to the degree of what we're seeing in the emergency department, the numbers of even young children, adolescents, teenagers who are coming in really in despair with depression, anxiety, inability to even cope and go to school, and on the extreme end, trying to commit suicide. And so it's a really big problem that we need to address. However, that is actually not going to address this sort of epidemic of violence that we're seeing at the same time. What we know is actually people or individuals with mental health disorders are actually at much higher risk for being a victim of firearm violence and violence in general, rather than being a perpetrator. So there are some streams of thought who feel like, if we can fix the mental health problem, which again, that's not something that's easily fixable, that this would address the firearm violence problem, but that's really not true. Again, we need to take care of our children and our youth with mental health disorders. However, we should do that just because that is important for those individuals, not as a way to address firearm violence in the United States. What is good, though, out of the funding that you talked about from the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, which is focused on, legislation for firearm related policies, there's a lot of funding for mental health. And again, I think we just need to understand that funding for mental health is going to provide access to care that is so critical for children, adolescents, but also for adults, throughout the United States. It's not just focused on children, but we need to be clear that that in and of itself is not a solution to decrease firearm violence in the United States, but is very important to address the mental health epidemic that we're seeing in our youth today. One thing I do want to point out while we're talking about mental health, that was also a big part of the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, is funding to enact more ERPO laws in the United States. So ERPO laws stand for Extreme Risk Protection Order laws. And basically, if an individual is at risk either for suicide or for committing homicide, that allows the courts to basically remove the rights of that individual from either possessing or purchasing a firearm. So if you as a family member know that somebody in your household is at risk for either committing suicide or homicide with a firearm, you can actually then take that to the courts and petition the courts to take the firearm either away and also prohibit their ability to purchase more firearms. And it's temporary, right? Just in that moment when that individual is at risk. So it's important to know if you have that law in your state. Only 19 states and the District of Columbia have those laws right now. But I think it's important for everybody to know that and to advocate, if your state doesn't have that law, there's now a lot of funding with that new Bipartisan Safer Communities Act for states to enact those laws.
Wow, this is some great information. Thank you. So here's a question for both of you guys. Leaving this conversation, what is your message that you want parents and our PTA leaders to remember? What are the two most important things that they can do right now to help ensure that all children are safe and welcome at school and in their community? And what is the message of hope?
Sure. Yeah, no, thank you for that. This has been such a great conversation, and I am hopeful. And my message of hope is that there are actions that we can take now that we know work, that we know are effective, and we know that they're helpful. Programs, policies, and practices. We've only shared just a few examples today, but there are many others. As leaders in schools and communities, I would encourage your membership to take advantage of the resources that we talked about today. Spend some time looking at the technical packages, for example, get familiar with the resources and reflect on which of the evidence-based strategies are most relevant to the populations that you serve, that you serve in your community, and to reflect on, how to make sure those are being implemented and implemented well. The second thing that I would mention is that you can work at the individual level as well. People have an opportunity to talk with their family and friends about the importance of securing firearms. I often hear that, the gun was at the top of the closet, or it was in a shoebox under the bed, and so my son doesn't know about it. It's not true. Just putting a firearm out of sight or out of reach is not safe storage. It's not enough to prevent use by children or adolescents. And it's really also important for parents to discuss secure firearm storage practices with their relatives and with their friends. There's a lot of resources out there, and we've included some on CDC's website as well to help gun owners to make informed decisions about secure storage. And I would encourage folks to take advantage of those. And then I'll just end by saying, if somebody who's watching this knows someone who's showing signs of suicide, or they need help for themselves or a family member, they can get that help using the 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. They can be connected with resources 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And so just encourage them to not be afraid to take action, to get help for themselves, to get help for others. And I just thank you so much for this time today and for including me in this conversation with you and Lois. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you for being here, Tom. And thank you for sharing some remarkable information with all of our PTA leaders. Lois?
Well, first, again, I also want to thank the National PTA for highlighting this important issue as such a large child advocate organization, along with American Academy of Pediatrics and with the CDC. Hopefully, we can really raise awareness for our families. So, one of the main messages is really that by and large, really our schools are safe, right, for the vast majority of children and youth in the United States. But there are ways that we can help keep our children safer. So I think organizations like the AAP, the CDC, working with the National PTA can really emphasize to families that when there are firearms in the home, that there are risks for suicide and risk for unintentional shootings as well as homicide. And so just considering what those risks are and how you are going to secure your firearms in your home and just being thoughtful about that. Suicide is very impulsive act. And oftentimes families think, my child doesn't know where the firearm is, but the truth is most of the time they do. And so I think really being thoughtful about how it's stored, whether or not keeping it in your home is the safest thing at the moment with your household is really a conversation that, households need to have. So I think there's, two things that parents and PTA leaders can do is have these conversations about having firearms in the home and, the risks. And not just risks in your own home, but also in the homes of where your children might go. So really asking about firearms in the homes of grandparents, uncles, aunts, friends. And that schools should continue to work with their communities, including law enforcement, right, to strengthen security in the schools to prevent unauthorized individuals from coming into the school. And that's not just for, concern about school shootings, but that's just for general safety. Obviously, this is a complicated problem that will need really a complex, multifaceted solution. But when organizations like ours, come together and we're focused on the safety of our kids, just like the parents are focused on the safety of our kids, I think we know that, this is a really wonderful first step to really beginning to address this important problem to keep all our children safe.
Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us and your messages of hope. Dr. Simon and Dr. Lee, there are words that I heard that just really hold strong to my heart right now. Community, listening, conversation, partnerships. It takes that village to take care of our children, and this is a great conversation, and I know our local leaders, our state leaders, district leaders, all of our members are going to join this conversation. So thank you so much for sharing that with us. PTA has been the conscience of our country on issues affecting children and youth for 125 years, and we will not go numb and never stop speaking loudly and demanding more for every child and young person across our country. National PTA remains committed to ensuring that every child reach their fullest potential, and we will only be able to do that if they stay safe and well throughout their childhood and into adulthood, and we know that. We want today's conversation to be just the start of an incredibly robust and critical dialogue with all of you and our nation's elected officials. And we encourage everyone listening to continue this fight with us. Sign up for our action alerts, join our monthly advocacy newsletter, get connected with your local and state PTA, and learn what you can do to build safe environments for children to learn, grow, and thrive. We will continue this fight. And we will continue to ask for health and safety for every child and well beyond today, and ask all of you to join us. And we really hope that you enjoy this conversation. I do personally, as much as I enjoyed this conversation and getting all of the resources and information that I need to become a better child advocate. Thank you, everyone, and we hope that you have a great day.